Today, 11 things every reefer should know about the science of lighting a reef tank.
What we wish someone had told us day one. Direct answer, believe it or not, lighting should actually be the easiest thing to get right on the tank and the least debated. It's hard to imagine. But it's a horizon to horizon option with that blue spectrum range. It's similar to the sun in that same area. It wraps the corals in light and then tuned with a par meter that you can actually return when you're done. This is the right answer.
Number 2, why horizon to horizon? Well, it's because corals have evolved to be wrapped in light. Not just from the directionality of the sun, but also diffuse light that comes down from the sky. Without it, they're going to shadow themselves, they're going to shadow their neighbors, and it's going to lead to funky growth patterns, slower growth, and sometimes even death.
In our test, we found the par in the shadows to be about 75% lower, which is a lot. I mean, you're taking 400 par down to 1. In actual tank, a lot of people are telling us they're like where the corals are dying, the inner bits of it, they put the par meter and it's like 5 par.
That's crazy.
That's why it's doing that. So that's kind of the nature of these small little focus lights that are really emulating the sun, but not the sky. And for those of you that don't know, what's really happening here is when the sun hits the earth, it actually scatters all the blue light out into the atmosphere. And that's why the whole sky actually looks blue. And what's happening now is the sun actually doesn't have that much blue light in it. The blue is what's driving most of the photosynthetic action in our corals. And so it's the sky that's coming from like a horizon to horizon angle. So we used to say that the light source should be bigger than the object you're illuminating, meaning like bigger than your aquascape. But really, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It just has to be horizon to horizon, which can be that big, but it can also be like 3-point lighting systems, which are like the sun, which is a single point of light, like our modules, filled in with like light bars that emulate the sky. So basically, we just need to wrap it from horizon to horizon, and that's why.
Number 3, you might be wondering, well, then how do I create this using an artificial light source? There's several ways to do this. The first is some sort of big fixture. We're talking like a T5 fixture that goes horizon to horizon, front to back, and it just blankets the tank in light.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with that. They make LED options like that, and they even make super giant modular things that are like that, stack them together. So it's really hard to ignore the success that has come from that type of fixture, but also, man, are they big. So another option that's really, really similar to that people have started doing more recently is what I'd call a modular fixture. So same value, horizon to horizon, big, covers the whole thing, but it's really just light strips like these. So I'm gonna take light strips like these, and instead of just using one as like some kind of supplemental light, use 5 or 4 of them, cover the same area, cover the same area using that, and then all of a sudden, man, I've created a fixture, but now I don't have that big, huge, hefty thing. And something like this that's super wide angle, these things actually can be mounted like right on the tank itself, so they just sit right on there and like you don't even see the light. So different option, but there's other ones too. Yeah,
you can use something like more of a medium-sized fixture, right? You can have something that has like ultra-wide lenses, and then you can just pack them a little bit closer together, and it's going to give you something very similar that's going to be horizon to horizon and quite a bit of light fill.
I think one of the disservices that's happened to the hobby is those medium-sized modules have like largely been sold to us as covering a 2-foot area. If you get it down to like about 18 inches, that seems to be the sweet spot where it really does that. And wider the angle, the better. If you see a lens on there that's focusing it, unless you specifically need that because you're mounting it to the ceiling or something, run, man. That's not the option probably for you. The wider, the better, because these things not only cover more area when they're wide, they're also bouncing off of the glass, they're bouncing off the sand, they're bouncing off the aquascape, they're bouncing off even light off the other coral. The reason that coral looks green is because it's bouncing light off of it. The reason it looks blue is because it's bouncing. So everything in the thing reflects light. The wider the angle we get, the better. So those modular options, really cool too. There's the other one though that I just talked about, the 3-point lighting.
Yeah, 3-point lighting. We're talking about really a hybrid system here, aren't we? Combining something like more of our strips on the side, but then what are you kind of putting in the middle there?
Well, so for me, like most of you know that most of my most successful tanks that I've set up have all been 3-point hybrids, being the Kessel, kind of emulating the sun, then flanked with fill lights. So it could be LEDs, it could be T5s. The real thing here isn't like there's not a magic T5 photon,
right?
Blessed. It's just about getting more light where it wasn't covered and using the right spectrum. I will say historically, some of the fill lights from LEDs tended to be, really narrow, whereas the glow specifically has a lot of that chlorophyll A zone in the violet range that many lights are missing. And so, pairing the glow with something like the Kessel, or even pairing them with the wide angle modules like the Radion, really do an awesome job for 3-point lighting where you're actually emulating the sun and the sky.
Number 4, why the similar wide blue spectrum to the sun? There's a few reasons for this. The first is that emulating the environment that the corals grew up in seems to make really good biological sense.
Not really just even like grew up in, evolved in for millennia. I was actually talking to a university professor about this the other day, and I was asking, like, how important do you think that it is that we hit these specific chlorophyll peaks and like offer a wide blue spectrum like the sun? And her answer was that biology makes relatively few long-term mistakes.
That's a great point.
I never really thought about that way. And yes, biology does make some mistakes along the way, but they are rare. And so when you emulate where it evolved around, you usually find success. Second is that we actually know, this is like fairly well-known science, that the actual peak where chlorophyll A absorbs the most energy, where chlorophyll C2 absorbs the most energy, where pidininin actually absorbs the most energy, and other carotenoids as well. And so if we cover that huge wide blue range rather than like just a single peak at like 450 royal blues, which is like, one of the approaches out there. If we cover that whole thing that emulates the sun, we're telling you that it's a combination of what we know about science, what we know about where they evolved from, and then here's the real killer. It also matches the things that we used in the past, being T5s and halides and stuff, where that blue band was much wider back then. And so personal experience and success matching what we know about science. And now that LEDs have like caught up and they're actually producing that same wide blue spectrum, it's what we should be using.
Number 5, how do I create that wide blue sunlight spectrum using artificial light? Well, really, it comes down to LEDs.
Yeah, just the selections, what they put in these things. And for you, it's probably a little bit too nerdy in most cases. So really all you're looking for is most of these lights will have some kind of like blue chart. What you're looking for is wider blue means better in a vast majority of cases. You can get really nitpicky in it because these things are like ratios. They're not actually just the offering, but like what we're looking for is, preferably something that ranges from about 390 nanometers to about 470 nanometers. And like, this sounds really nerdy, but just go look at the little numbers on the chart. You'll see it should be in that range. The best ones will cover the most of that area in there. Some of them will even go beyond that into like UV or near UV anyway, like real deep violet. They could go beyond that, but really what you're just looking at is like, if all I really needed to know is like, which of these lights is better, wider is better. And most experienced reefers and most actual marine biologists would agree with that. There's one caveat to that. So don't look at just the top, because the top, these things are ratios. So if you're looking at like the bottom, like maybe third or half of it, that will show you the whole breadth of it. Because you can actually increase the total amount of spectrum just by decreasing one of them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if it doesn't have any of it at the bottom, it just doesn't exist.
Number 6, why does PAR matter? 2 primary reasons here. First, of course, PAR controls energy production for the coral. Too little PAR, and we all know you're gonna starve it, but too much PAR means too much oxidant production, and that's gonna kill the coral.
Yeah, so basically the photosynthetic energy is going to help the zooxanthellae create like simple sugars like glucose and glycerol. It will produce more than it actually needs, and it leaks it into the animal, the coral, and the coral then lives off of that. So if we crank down the photosynthetic energy or PAR, we're literally going to starve the coral to death. If we actually have too much, well, now the rate of photosynthesis is happening so fast and it's creating so many oxidants and free radicals that those things actually poison the coral, and then in a desperate attempt to try to survive, it expels all of its zooxanthellae, which it very much needs for food, and that's all gone. So hitting that PAR segment, and what we're talking about here is for LPS, it's pretty well agreed upon that somewhere between 50 and 150 is usually pretty good, and for SPS, 200 to 350 is pretty good. Outside of that zone, leave it to the trailblazers, or even like as you get more and more years under your belt, you can try outside of those ranges. But those are the ranges that if you had to hit it, you would be successful. You wouldn't poison the coral and you wouldn't starve it.
Number 7, how do I tune PAR on one of these artificial lights? Well, there's really one way to do it, and one way only. It's using a PAR meter. PAR is impossible to tell just by the eye. The eye is just not good at recognizing how much PAR is in a light. And it almost has nothing to do with brightness, actually. Outside of using a PAR meter, you're just guessing and crossing your fingers and hoping you got lucky.
The human eye is a terrible measurement.
It's terrible at it.
There's a couple of reasons for that. The human eye is like really, really sensitive to green, and it perceives green as much brighter than other colors. And it's really not sensitive to blue range, and the blue range is where all the PAR is. So your human eye is like built like the opposite of what we would need it to do here. So when you go look up and it's like, oh, this tank's really bright, it's probably because there's a lot of like white, which is green and yellow, and orange and red mixed in there. But if you only had the blue lights on, you'd say, oh, this looks pretty dim. But it's actually really, really high PAR. Right. In fact, we actually did an investigates here. Yeah, where we went around and asked a bunch of people, like people that own fish stores, people that do tank installs, even Brent here, who tests lights for a living. If you watched our recent series on lighting, you know that he spent 6 months in this, but he's really spent many years on this. Even asked him to do it. Nobody could consistently guess the PAR anywhere even remotely close. The human eye is terrible at this. Listen to it. There's some people out there saying, no, I did it. Yeah, there's also some people, they're just lucky.
Number 8, well, why is returning the PAR meter better than keeping it?
For those who don't know, as a service here, we allow you to return your PAR meter after using it for 2 months. There is a restocking fee on it, but man, you got to use it for 2 months and tuned your light. But why would you want to like return it? Like not just for the monetary advantages, but there's another advantage that you probably didn't think of. Like just let's get this thing out of your house.
No, and I think this is super important for beginners because I know I made this mistake a lot. If you have a tool, you want to use it. I was that way. I had a tool, I wanted to use it. And the things that your corals need above all else is stability. So if you return that PAR meter, that means you're not going to adjust your lights. You're going to keep them where they are because corals are really resilient and they can adjust to a lot of different things, but what they aren't good at is adjusting to constant changes.
Okay, so the thing that we've been told over and over again is corals are amazingly adaptive creatures. They will adapt to most environments if you just let it. Okay, so what I've also been told is basically what that really means is that there are levels of chlorophyll A, C2, and various carotenoids, and even compounds that they build together to capture light, and they will adjust that to the light that's provided to them, given the time. And by given the time, I don't mean next week. No. It seems like it actually takes a really long time for it to adjust to that. So if we're constantly flipping switches and changing things, that is where things die. Yeah. Like you should assume that every time that you make a change, it will get worse, not better. Yeah. Even if it's already bad, it's going to get worse, not better, because these corals, like they will adapt to it if you just let them. So I don't know if it really means that you should send the meter back just obviously for the monetary advantages, but like really resist any temptation. And that's what I think about all of the really old school technologies of halides, T-Vise and stuff. You plugged it in the wall, that was your only choice, man. And I didn't want to buy a whole bunch of new bulbs, so I didn't swap them out all the time, you know. And then if I did swap them out, they were going to be in there for 18 months until next time. And so even then, you would see people who swap out new bulbs, and they would say, "Oh, it's not really the same." Well, they changed the the spectrum to a little bit, and I also changed probably the par levels of some of these bulbs. So it makes sense. So return the par meter when you're done with it. Put all that money back in your wallet and resist the temptation to change anything.
Number 9, well then why not green, yellow, orange, and red spectrum like the sun? Well, they have limited roles in photosynthesis and ultimately make the corals look brown as well. We are tuning here for biology and an appealing display simultaneely.
You do want the tank to look good.
You do.
Not just healthy, but visually, like I spent a lot of money to put this in my living room. I want to look nice. So yeah, that's the point here. So we talk about matching the blue spectrum of the sun, or getting at least close to that instead of just tiny little peaks at very specific points. Getting a wide blue band. But why don't we talk about it for all the rest of it? Well, like green really has a limited photosynthetic value. Yellow has limited. Orange has some. And then red theoretically does, because chlorophyll A can certainly use that, and it may actually even be necessary. But how much red are they really getting at 30 feet deep in the water? Because the water filters out like a lot of it. It isn't really intense. We know that for sure. That's definitely filtered out much of it. But those things just aren't as important to get perfectly. And then even if we did get them perfectly, well, the display would look like garbage and you wouldn't be happy with it.
Number 10, well then why do some corals seem to pop under blue lights and others look this kind of drab blue?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to we learned these lessons in grade school, but many of us forgot them. The reason that something looks blue is because it doesn't absorb blue light. It's absorbing all the rest of them and then reflecting blue light back your eye. So like a leaf looks green because it's absorbing most of all the photosynthetic energy of reds and blues. And then what it didn't need was green. It reflects that back at your eye. So that's happening in the tank as well. So if I only put blue light in there, basically everything's gonna look blue with one exception.
Yeah.
Fluorescence.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, how does that work?
So fluorescence, what it actually does is instead of being a pigment that reflects light, it absorbs lower wavelength blue light and then re-emits it back out as green and yellow and even red in some cases. So it will re-affect like different shades of those variations even. So it creates a really stunning look because there's really high contrast between what was blue and now it's just popping this yellow or green color. So when you turn on all the lights on blue, you can really tell which ones have fluorescent proteins and which ones have color pigments, because all the things with color pigments will just look bland blue. Now the inverse is true though too. If instead of having the blues on and I turn on mostly just the whites, and those things have all of the color, that's because those things are reflecting those pigments back at my eye. Zoanthids come to mind. They have a lot of color. There's a bunch of different corals out there that you're actually gonna see the best color from the whites.
Number 11, well then what promotes that fluorescence? Because honestly, a lot of us love that part of the hobby. Well, it's strongly believed that the lack of green, yellow, orange, and that red spectrum will cause the coral to actually create its own light in those spectrums.
This is the cool part. Like, once you understand the difference between like what's happening and why it's happening. So what's happening, we know for years that, or even decades, that for some reason when you put the corals under just blue light, they tend to create more fluorescent proteins and build more of that pop, right? And then you put them under white light and often they will actually create more kind of like a brownish look to them, right? Like why is that if it's the same par? So one of the things that's been recently explained to me, and part of the why here, is that some of these corals actually need those spectrums. So to complete the photosynthetic process, they actually need some of those other colors. So it creates it for itself.
That's cool.
Right? So it takes the fluorescent, takes the blue light, pulls it in, and then re-emits it back out as those other colors called fluorescence, where it actually uses its own light to complete the process. And I think a really, really cool thing. So thinking about why it does it will help you create it in the first place.
My primary takeaway here is that the most important thing to focus on, there's so much to talk about, but if you consider just creating a wall-to-wall blanket of light and just following some good advice, from some of our videos, finding someone who has a similar setup who's had success, and just create a blanket, leave it, and don't touch it, I think you're gonna find the most success.
My number one takeaway in all this is that these compact light sources that we've been using over the years, one space like every 2 feet, look pretty nice on the outside of the tank, like low profile, and they're reasonable solutions for a first tank. But serious reefers will always gravitate to these big, wide fixtures, larger panels, ultra wide angle modules, or one of my personal favorites, the 3-point lighting, where you emulate the sun and the fill light to create something that matches the nature and actually create something really cool, because you can adjust that shimmer in there too, get that sense of depth and rhythm and movement, because I really want awesome biology and I want the tank to look awesome as a display as well. What's next? Time to take everything that we just talked about and then compile it into how to select the right lighting solution. Most specifically, how do we get it right the first time, because that will save a lot of cost.
And all of our best of reef and tank lighting playlists right here.